Have you ever noticed that the more deeply you think, the more out of place you feel? That society doesn't reward clarity, but punishes it? In this video, we will expose why deep thinkers are subtly treated as a threat, why intelligence invites resistance instead of respect, and how understanding this can protect your power instead of destroying it. Thought, when it goes deep enough, becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Not rebellion in the loud, dramatic sense that attracts attention and punishment, but a subtler, more dangerous form, internal refusal. Society is built on continuity. It survives by ensuring that most people think tomorrow what they thought yesterday, desire what they are shown, and fear what they are instructed to fear. Deep thinking interrupts this continuity. It introduces friction into a system that depends on smooth repetition. At the surface level, society claims to value thinking. It praises intelligence, education, and creativity, but only within carefully drawn boundaries. Thinking is welcomed as long as it reinforces existing structures. The moment thought begins to question the legitimacy of those structures, their morality, their purpose, their hidden incentives, it is no longer celebrated. It is treated as disruption. Deep thought exposes that much of what is considered normal is simply habitual obedience dressed up as virtue. Most people do not consciously choose their beliefs. They inherit them. Opinions are absorbed through repetition, authority, and social reward. Agreement brings acceptance, while deviation invites friction. In such an environment, thinking independently is not just difficult, it is socially costly. The deep thinker senses this early. They notice that certain questions make conversations uncomfortable, that certain observations are met with silence or hostility, that clarity is often received as an insult. This reaction is not personal. It is structural. A system designed around collective compliance cannot tolerate too many individuals who pause to examine its foundations. Thought becomes disobedience the moment it refuses emotional synchronization. Social order relies heavily on shared emotional rhythms, shared outrage, shared enthusiasm, shared fear. These emotions move faster than reason, which is why they are so effective in shaping behavior. The deep thinker resists the speed. They do not react immediately. They observe first. They analyze motives, patterns, and consequences. This delay alone separates them from the crowd. To those who move by impulse, restraint looks like defiance. What truly unsettles society is not that the deep thinker disagrees, but that they do not need permission to do so. Their mind is not governed by applause or punishment. This internal autonomy is rare, and rarity is always perceived as a threat. A person who thinks for themselves is difficult to predict, and what cannot be predicted cannot be efficiently controlled. Power does not fear opposition as much as it fears independence. Opposition can be managed, negotiated, or crushed. Independence quietly undermines authority by making it irrelevant. Deep thinking also strips social roles of their illusion. Titles, rituals, moral posturing, these lose their sacred aura under scrutiny. The deep thinker sees that many rules exist not because they are true or just, but because they are convenient. This awareness creates distance. Once distance exists, obedience becomes conditional rather than automatic. That conditional obedience is the beginning of disobedience, even if no external action follows. This is why societies instinctively marginalize deep thinkers. They are labeled impractical, detached, or overly complicated. These labels serve a psychological function. They reassure the collective that deviation is a flaw, not a signal. By framing deep thought as dysfunction, society protects itself from having to confront what that thought reveals. The goal is not to silence a thinker entirely, but to reduce their influence, to ensure their insights remain private curiosities rather than contagious ideas. Yet deep thinkers rarely seek rebellion. Their disobedience is a byproduct, not an intention. They do not think in order to oppose. They oppose because they think. Their loyalty is not to groups or traditions, but to coherence. When beliefs contradict reality, they notice. When moral narratives clash with behavior, they observe. This creates an internal conflict between honesty and belonging. Most choose belonging. The deep thinker chooses honesty, often without realizing the price until it is already paid. Over time, this disobedience becomes internalized. The deep thinker learns to separate inner freedom from external conformity. Outwardly, they may comply. Inwardly, they remain unconvinced. This silent division is dangerous to social order because it cannot be easily detected or corrected. Laws regulate behavior, not perception. Institutions control actions, not understanding. A mind that has withdrawn its belief has already stepped outside the system, even if the body remains within it. Thought, at its deepest level, is therefore not a passive activity. It is an active withdrawal from collective hypnosis. It breaks the spell of inevitability that social order depends on. Once a person sees that things are arranged rather than destined, enforced rather than natural, obedience loses its moral weight. It becomes a choice instead of a duty. And a society built on duty cannot survive if too many people begin to choose. The mass mind versus the individual mind. Society functions by compressing millions of individuals into a single psychological rhythm. This rhythm is not created through reason, but through imitation. People learn what to think by watching what is rewarded, what is punished, and what is repeated often enough to feel familiar. The mass mind is not an accumulation of independent thoughts. It is a synchronization of borrowed ones. Its strength lies not in intelligence, but in unanimity. When many think alike, the illusion of correctness emerges, and doubt appears unnecessary. The individual mind operates differently. It does not move by consensus, but by coherence. Instead of asking what is popular, it asks what is consistent. Instead of reacting to the emotional temperature of the crowd, it measures ideas against observation and experience. This difference in operation immediately creates friction. The mass mind perceives deviation as instability because it threatens the psychological comfort of shared belief. Agreement feels safe not because it is true, but because it is shared. The mass mind depends heavily on emotional contagion. Feelings spread faster than thoughts, and this speed allows societies to mobilize, condemn, celebrate, and obey with minimal reflection. The individual mind resists this contagion. It does not surrender itself easily to collective excitement or collective fear. This resistance is often misinterpreted as coldness or lack of empathy. In reality, it is a refusal to confuse intensity with truth. Where the crowd feels first and thinks later, the individual mind observes first and feels after understanding. This difference creates a subtle but powerful tension. The mass mind requires participation to maintain its coherence. Silence feels like disapproval. Neutrality feels like betrayal. The individual mind, however, values distance. It understands that constant participation clouds perception. By stepping back, it preserves clarity, but in doing so, it violates an unspoken social rule, emotional alignment. The crowd demands visible agreement, not just passive compliance. A person who does not echo the collective mood becomes suspicious, even when they cause no harm. The mass mind is deeply attached to narratives. These narratives simplify reality into moral stories with heroes, villains, and clear conclusions. Complexity threatens these stories because it introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity weakens emotional commitment. The individual mind is drawn to complexity. It sees contradictions, mixed motives, and unintended consequences. This makes it difficult to fully accept simplified explanations. As a result, the individual mind often appears unsatisfied, critical, or perpetually questioning. To the mass mind, this questioning feels like erosion. If too many questions are allowed, the story collapses. Power structures instinctively favor the mass mind because it is efficient. It responds to symbols, slogans, and authority. It does not require detailed explanation. It requires repetition. The individual mind is inefficient by comparison. It demands justification. It resists emotional shortcuts. It notices when language is used to manipulate rather than to clarify. This resistance makes it costly to manage. A system designed for scale cannot afford to negotiate with every independent mind, so it discourages individuality at a psychological level long before it ever becomes political. The mass mind also fears isolation, and this fear keeps it obedient. Belonging is a powerful incentive. Shared beliefs act as social glue, holding people together even when those beliefs are internally fragile. The individual mind is more tolerant of isolation because it finds stability within understanding rather than approval. This does not mean it seeks loneliness, but it is less willing to trade clarity for acceptance. This willingness to stand alone, even silently, undermines a mass mind's greatest weapon, social pressure. Over time, the conflict between these two modes of mind becomes unavoidable. The mass mind interprets difference as superiority or hostility. It assumes that anyone who does not align must be judging. This assumption creates resentment. The individual mind, on the other hand, often underestimates the emotional investment the crowd has in its beliefs. It treats ideas as objects to be examined, not identities to be defended. This mismatch leads to misunderstanding. What feels like curiosity to one side feels like attack to the other. The mass mind survives by dissolving individuality into sameness. The individual mind survives by maintaining internal distinction. One seeks comfort through numbers, the other seeks stability through understanding. When these two collide, the mass mind almost always wins in the social arena because it controls norms, rewards, and punishments. But victory does not mean correctness. It only means dominance. The deeper the individual mind goes, the more it recognizes that most social beliefs exist not because they are true, but because they are shared. This realization creates a permanent distance that cannot be undone. Once a person sees how easily opinions spread without examination, trust in collective judgment weakens. The individual mind no longer experiences a crowd as a source of guidance, but as a psychological force to be observed. In that moment, the person steps outside the emotional gravity of the mass, not physically, but internally. Why power distrusts intelligence? Power is often imagined as force, authority, or visible dominance, but in reality it is something far more delicate. It is the management of perception and behavior on a large scale. For this management to work, responses must be predictable. People must react in expected ways to symbols, rewards, punishments, and narratives. Intelligence, when it operates deeply and independently, interferes with this predictability. This is why power does not merely ignore intelligence, it instinctively distrusts it. The intelligent mind does not accept appearances at face value. It searches for causes, incentives, and hidden structures beneath what is presented. Power, however, relies heavily on surfaces. It uses language, ritual, and moral framing to guide behavior without constant enforcement. When these surfaces are examined too closely, their artificial nature becomes visible. Intelligence turns implicit assumptions into explicit questions, and once something is questioned, it loses its absolute authority. Power prefers obedience that feels voluntary. The most stable systems are those in which people believe they are choosing freely while moving within carefully designed boundaries. Deep intelligence threatens this illusion. It notices the boundaries. It recognizes how choices are framed, how alternatives are limited, and how consent is manufactured through fear or desire. A person who understands these mechanisms no longer responds automatically. They hesitate, and hesitation weakens control. Another reason power distrusts intelligence is that intelligence resists simplification. Power communicates through reduction. Complex realities are condensed into slogans, categories, and moral binaries. These tools are effective because they are easy to remember and emotionally charged. Intelligence disrupts this process by reintroducing nuance. It complicates what was meant to be simple. It exposes that many issues presented as moral absolutes are actually conflict of interest. Complexity slows mobilization, and anything that slows collective movement is seen as an obstacle. Intelligent individuals are also less responsive to status signals. Power often maintains itself through hierarchy, titles, and symbolic authority. These signals work best on those who equate position with legitimacy. Intelligence separates the role from the person. It evaluates authority based on competence and consistency rather than rank. This evaluation is deeply unsettling to power because it shifts legitimacy from structure to substance. When authority must constantly justify itself, it becomes fragile. There is also an emotional dimension to this distrust. Power depends on shared emotional states: fear of exclusion, hope of reward, anxiety about uncertainty. Intelligent minds are not immune to emotion, but they are less governed by it. They recognize when emotions are being provoked intentionally. This awareness reduces susceptibility. A population that feels less intensely is harder to stay. Emotional moderation, therefore, appears as coldness or detachment, but it is actually a form of resistance. Power is especially wary of intelligence that remains silent. Loud dissent can be confronted, debated, or punished. Quiet understanding cannot. A person who sees clearly but does not announce it cannot be easily categorized. They blend in while remaining internally unconvinced. This internal independence is dangerous because it spreads invisibly. Others sense it through tone, restraint, and refusal to fully participate in emotional theater. It introduces doubt without ever stating an argument. Intelligence also remembers. Power benefits from short attention spans and selective memory. When mistakes are forgotten, patterns remain hidden. Intelligent minds track continuity. They notice repetition in behavior, broken promises, and recycled narratives. This memory transforms isolated events into patterns, and patterns into predictions. A person who can predict behavior is no longer surprised by it, and surprise is one of power's most effective tools. Historically, power has attempted to domesticate intelligence rather than eliminate it. It channels intelligent minds into technical, administrative, or abstract roles where their insight serves a system without questioning its foundations. Intelligence is rewarded when it optimizes existing structures, but discouraged when it interrogates their purpose. This distinction reveals a true fear. Power does not fear intelligence as capacity. It fears intelligence as independence. The intelligent mind, when fully developed, becomes internally governed. It does not require constant validation, instruction, or supervision. It forms its own judgments and corrects itself through reflection rather than social feedback. Such a mind is inefficient from the perspective of control. It cannot be managed through simple incentives. It must be reasoned with, and reasoning is slow, uncertain, and often inconclusive. This is why power gravitates toward loyalty over intelligence, enthusiasm over insight, and conformity over competence. Loyalty is reliable. Enthusiasm is contagious. Conformity is scalable. Intelligence, when left unchecked, disrupts all three. It introduces conditions, delays, and doubts. It asks not only how things are done, but why they are done at all. In asking this, it shifts attention away from obedience toward understanding, and understanding quietly rearranges a balance between ruler and ruled. Isolation is the price of insight. Insight separates before it enlightens. The moment a person begins to see beneath appearances, a subtle distance forms between them and the world around them. This distance is not chosen out of pride or disdain, but emerges naturally from perception itself. When understanding deepens, participation changes. What once felt obvious begins to feel constructed. What once felt meaningful begins to reveal its mechanical nature. This shift alters how the individual relates to others, and isolation quietly takes root. Social life is sustained by shared assumptions. Conversations flow smoothly when people agree on what matters, what deserves respect, and what should not be questioned. Insight disrupts this flow. The individual who sees contradictions, hidden motives, and psychological patterns cannot fully immerse themselves in surface-level exchanges. They hear what is being said, but they also hear what is being avoided. This double awareness creates a gap that cannot be easily closed. To speak honestly would disturb the peace. To remain silent deepens a sense of separation. Isolation is often misunderstood as a social failure, but in this context it is a psychological consequence. As insight grows, the individual becomes less emotionally reactive to social cues. Praise loses some of its intoxicating effect. Criticism loses its sting. Approval becomes less necessary. This emotional independence is misread by others as indifference or superiority. In reality, it is a recalibration of value. The individual no longer measures worth through collective opinion, and this alone places him outside the emotional economy of the group. The insightful mind also becomes selective in its attachments. When one understands how often relationships are driven by convenience, validation, or shared illusion, indiscriminate closeness becomes difficult. The desire for depth replaces the need for frequency. Fewer connections feel preferable to many shallow ones. This selectivity further reduces social presence, not because the individual dislikes people, but because they seek coherence rather than comfort. The crowd offers comfort. Insight demands coherence. Another source of isolation lies in the loss of shared enthusiasm. Collective excitement thrives on simplification and exaggeration. It requires participants to suspend doubt and surrender to momentum. The insightful individual struggles with the surrender. They notice when enthusiasm is disproportionate, when outrage is performative, when celebration masks anxiety. This awareness dampens emotional participation. Others sense this restraint and interpret it as lack of spirit or loyalty. Over time, invitations diminish, not by conspiracy, but by emotional mismatch. Insight also alters a perception of morality. Many social bonds are reinforced through shared moral outrage and virtue signaling. These displays function as signals of belonging. The insightful mind sees how morality is often used less as a guide for action and more as a tool for status. This recognition creates discomfort. To participate feels dishonest. To abstain feels isolating. The individual is left in a liminal space, aware of the game but unwilling to play it convincingly. Loneliness deepens when insight reveals the extent to which most people avoid self-examination. The insightful individual notices how frequently others defend beliefs not because they are true, but because they protect identity. Conversations circle around reassurance rather than discovery. This creates a sense of speaking different languages within the same words. Even when surrounded by people, the individual feels unseen, not because they are ignored, but because what they see cannot be easily shared. Over time, isolation becomes internal as well as external. The individual learns to rely on their own understanding for orientation. Reflection replaces validation. Solitude becomes less threatening and more stabilizing. This adaptation is often mistaken for withdrawal, but it is closer to consolidation. The mind gathers itself rather than dispersing into social noise. Yet this internal stability comes with a cost. The warmth of effortless belonging fades. Social interactions require conscious adjustment rather than instinctive participation. Insight also removes the comfort of illusion. Many social rituals function as psychological shelters, protecting individuals from uncertainty and existential discomfort. When these shelters are seen through, they lose their protective power. The insightful individual stands exposed to ambiguity without the buffer of collective certainty. This exposure can feel heavy. Without shared myths to lean on, the individual must carry meaning alone. This burden contributes to a sense of isolation that is not alleviated by company. Despite this, isolation is not purely negative. It creates space for depth, clarity, and internal order. But it is a price, not a reward. It is a quiet consequence of seeing too clearly in a world that prefers comforting blindness. The more accurately one perceives human behavior, the harder it becomes to fully participate in it without pretense. Insight sharpens perception, but it also narrows a circle of those with whom perception can be shared without distortion.